"That's my seat, kid," the white businessman said dismissively, towering over 12-year-old Darius Washington, who sat calmly in first-class seat 3A. The boy held up his boarding pass, but Richard Blackstone barely glanced at it. The flight attendant approached, and without checking either ticket, gestured toward economy. "Perhaps the young man would be more comfortable back there," she suggested with a patronizing smile. Darius felt every eye in first class watching as shame burned in his chest. His million-dollar company and tomorrow's crucial investor meeting suddenly feeling as worthless as the assumptions surrounding him. The morning had started with such promise. Darius had risen at dawn in his family's penthouse overlooking downtown Atlanta, his stomach churning with the familiar mixture of excitement and nerves that preceded every major business presentation. At 12 years old, he had already revolutionized how low-income communities accessed clean energy through his app Ecotech Solutions. But tomorrow's meeting with Sterling Dynamics represented the biggest opportunity of his young career. A chance to secure $50 million in funding that would bring sustainable power to underserved neighborhoods across the nation. His mother, Dr. Amelia Washington, had helped him pack his presentation materials with the same meticulous care she brought to her work as a renowned cardiac surgeon. "Remember, baby," she had said, straightening his navy blazer one final time, "you belong in every room you enter. Your ideas, your innovation, your heart. That's what matters, not what anyone else thinks when they first see you." Those words echoed in his mind now as Richard Blackstone's shadow fell across his seat like a storm cloud blocking the sun. The man's expensive charcoal suit and platinum watch spoke of inherited wealth and unquestioned privilege, the kind of power that had never been challenged or forced to justify its existence. His pale blue eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had spent 53 years believing the world owed him deference simply for existing. "I said that's my seat," Blackstone repeated, his voice rising enough to draw curious glances from other first-class passengers. "I don't know how you got that boarding pass, but I've been flying this route in seat 3A for 15 years. There's obviously been some kind of mistake." Darius looked up at the man with the steady composure that had served him well in boardrooms filled with skeptical adults. "Sir, my boarding pass clearly shows seat 3A. I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago for my business trip to New York." His voice carried the careful articulation his speech coach had helped him develop, each word precisely chosen to project competence despite his youth. The flight attendant, Sandra Mills, stepped closer with the practiced smile of someone trained to defuse conflicts before they escalated. But instead of examining both boarding passes with equal scrutiny, she focused her attention on Blackstone, her body language unconsciously deferential to his obvious wealth and status. "Mr. Blackstone, I see you're having a seating issue," she said, her tone immediately more respectful than the one she had used with Darius. "Let me see what I can do to resolve this quickly." "The boy is in my seat," Blackstone stated flatly, as if Darius were an inanimate object rather than a paying passenger. "I need him moved immediately. I have critical work to do during this flight, and I specifically requested this seat for the extra space and privacy." Sandra's gaze shifted to Darius, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. A 12-year-old black boy versus a wealthy white businessman. The math of customer service hierarchy was apparently simple in her mind. "Young man, would you mind if we found you another seat? Perhaps in our premium economy section? I'm sure you'd be just as comfortable there." The suggestion hit Darius like a physical blow. He had paid full price for his first-class ticket, had earned every dollar through late nights coding and early mornings pitching his ideas to investors who initially saw him as nothing more than a novelty. The assumption that he would be just as comfortable in a lesser seat because of his age and race revealed everything about how the world saw him. "Ma'am, I have a confirmed reservation for this seat," Darius replied, his voice remaining steady despite the anger building in his chest. "I paid for first class because I need the space to prepare for an important business presentation tomorrow. Moving to economy would significantly impact my ability to work." Blackstone let out a harsh laugh that carried no humor. "Business presentation? You're 12 years old. What kind of business could you possibly have that's more important than mine?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Darius felt the familiar weight of having to prove his worth to adults who had already decided he didn't belong. Around them, other passengers had begun to take notice of the confrontation, their conversations dropping to whispers as they turned to watch the drama unfold. "I'm the founder and CEO of Ecotech Solutions," Darius said, his voice carrying across the cabin with quiet authority. "We've developed technology that makes solar energy accessible and affordable for low-income communities. Tomorrow's meeting could secure funding to expand our program nationwide, potentially bringing clean energy to millions of families who currently can't afford it." The revelation rippled through the first-class cabin like electricity. Passengers who had been watching with idle curiosity now stared with genuine interest, their assumptions crumbling in real time. A woman in her 60s leaned forward in her seat, her expression shifting from dismissive to intrigued. A young couple exchanged surprised glances, clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the boy in seat 3A. But Blackstone's expression only hardened further, as if Darius's success was a personal affront to the natural order of things. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "Children don't run companies. They don't have business meetings with real investors. This is obviously some kind of publicity stunt or charity case." The words cut deeper than any physical wound could have. Darius had heard variations of this dismissal countless times, from venture capitalists who patted his head while ignoring his presentations, from tech journalists who wrote about him as a curiosity rather than a serious entrepreneur, from adults who couldn't reconcile his age and race with his achievements. Sandra looked between them uncertainly, clearly out of her depth in a situation that had escalated far beyond a simple seating dispute. "Perhaps we could." "No," Darius interrupted, his voice carrying a new edge of determination. "I'm not moving. I paid for this seat, I have a confirmed reservation, and I have every right to occupy it. Mr. Blackstone's assumptions about my age or my business don't change those facts." The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Blackstone's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Other passengers watched with the fascination of people witnessing something they knew would be talked about for years to come. In that moment, suspended between takeoff and an uncertain resolution, everyone in first class understood they were witnessing more than just a dispute over airline seating. They were watching the collision of two worlds, one built on assumptions about who deserved success and respect, and another where merit and innovation mattered more than age or appearance. What none of them could have predicted was how this confrontation would expose truths about power, privilege, and prejudice that would ultimately change not just their flight, but the trajectory of everyone involved. As the tension reached its breaking point, Darius Washington sat straighter in his seat, his young shoulders carrying the weight of every assumption that had ever been made about him, preparing to fight for his right to occupy the space he had earned. The silence stretched until Captain James Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a brief delay due to air traffic control. The interruption seemed to break the spell that had held the first-class cabin in suspended animation, but the tension remained thick as fog. Darius used the moment to pull out his tablet, not in retreat but as a strategic move that would either validate his claims or expose him as the fraud Blackstone clearly believed him to be. "You want to know about my business?" Darius said, his fingers dancing across the screen with the fluid confidence of someone who had grown up in the digital age. Ecotech Solutions has processed over $2 million in energy savings for families in underserved communities across the Southeast. We've partnered with local governments in 12 cities and have a waiting list of 40 more. The tablet screen came alive with charts, graphs, and testimonials that painted a picture of genuine impact. A grandmother in Birmingham describing how the app had cut her electricity bill in half. A young father in New Orleans explaining how the savings had allowed him to afford his daughter's asthma medication. Children in Atlanta playing in community centers powered entirely by optimized solar arrays that Darius's algorithms had made financially viable. Blackstone leaned forward despite himself, his businessman's instincts warring with his prejudices as he absorbed the data. The numbers were impressive, too impressive to be fabricated by a 12-year-old, even one with obvious technical skills. How did you even think of this?" The question opened a door to memories that Darius rarely shared with strangers, but something about this moment, the public nature of the challenge, the weight of representing more than just himself, compelled him to speak with unusual openness. 3 years ago, my grandmother's electricity was shut off during a heat wave because she couldn't afford the bill. She was too proud to ask for help, and we didn't find out until she ended up in the hospital with heat exhaustion. His voice carried the pain of that memory, the guilt of a 9-year-old who had felt powerless to help someone he loved. While she was recovering, I started researching energy costs in her neighborhood. I discovered that families were paying 30% more for electricity than people in wealthier areas, even though they used less power. The infrastructure was older, less efficient, and nobody seemed to care about fixing it. Sandra had stopped pretending to work on her tablet, drawn into the story despite her earlier bias. Other passengers leaned closer, their expensive meals and business concerns temporarily forgotten in the face of genuine human connection. Even Blackstone found himself listening with reluctant attention, his worldview being challenged by a narrative that didn't fit his preconceptions. So I taught myself to code, Darius continued, his fingers still moving across the tablet as he pulled up the app's interface. I spent 2 years learning everything I could about solar technology, energy distribution, and community organizing. The breakthrough came when I realized that the problem wasn't just technical, it was social. People in low-income neighborhoods didn't trust new technology because they'd been burned by promises before. The app's design reflected this understanding. Instead of the sleek, minimalist aesthetic favored by most tech companies, Ecotech solutions featured warm colors, clear language, and testimonials from real community members. Every screen included photos of local families who had benefited from the program, creating a sense of connection and trust that traditional energy companies had never bothered to establish. The app doesn't just optimize solar panel placement, Darius explained, his passion for the subject overriding his awareness of the hostile audience. It connects families with local installers who offer payment plans, helps them navigate utility company bureaucracy, and creates community networks where neighbors can share experiences and support each other through the transition. A woman in her 40s who had been watching from across the aisle finally spoke up. "My company does corporate sustainability consulting," she said, her voice carrying professional respect that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "What you're describing addresses market failures that billion-dollar energy companies haven't been able to solve. How did you get the funding to develop something this sophisticated?" The question touched on another source of pride and pain for Darius. "I started with my own savings, birthday money, allowance, money I earned doing coding projects for local businesses. When I had a working prototype, I entered every business plan competition I could find. Most judges dismissed me because of my age, but a few saw the potential." He pulled up a news article from the previous year showing himself accepting a check for $50,000 from the Atlanta Young Entrepreneurs Foundation. The photo captured him in a moment of pure joy, his smile radiant as he held the oversized check that had allowed him to hire his first employee and expand beyond his bedroom office. "The real breakthrough came when Mrs. Eleanor Chan saw my presentation at a community meeting in Chinatown," Darius said, his voice softening with genuine affection. She was 83 years old and had been fighting the utility company for 20 years about unfair billing practices. "She became my first beta tester, and when her electricity bill dropped by 60% in the first month, word spread through the community like wildfire." Blackstone shifted uncomfortably in the aisle, his earlier certainty beginning to crack under the weight of evidence and authentic emotion. The boy's story had the ring of truth that couldn't be manufactured, the kind of organic detail that only came from lived experience. More troubling was the growing realization that his own assumptions had been not just wrong, but actively harmful. "The hardest part wasn't the technology," Darius continued, seemingly unaware of Blackstone's internal struggle. "It was convincing adults to take me seriously. Investors would pat my head and tell me to come back when I was older. Utility company executives would refuse to meet with me at all. Even some community leaders were skeptical about trusting their neighbor's energy needs to a kid." Sandra found herself nodding involuntarily, recognizing the dismissive attitudes Darius described from her own experiences as a young woman in the airline industry. The realization that she had been perpetuating the same kind of bias just minutes earlier sent a flush of shame across her cheeks. "But the families who used the app became my advocates," Darius said, his voice gaining strength as he reached the heart of his story. When Mrs. Chen's granddaughter could afford to go to college because of the money they saved on electricity, when Mr. Rodriguez could keep his diabetes medication refrigerated during power outages because of the backup systems we helped him install. Those stories spoke louder than any business plan. The tablet screen now showed a map of the Southeast dotted with green pins, each representing a community where ecotech solutions had made a measurable impact. The visual was striking. Hundreds of points of light spreading across regions that traditional energy companies had written off as unprofitable markets. Tomorrow's meeting with Sterling Dynamics isn't just about funding, Darius said, his young voice carrying the weight of responsibility that most adults never experienced. It's about scaling this solution to reach millions of families who are still choosing between electricity and groceries, between air conditioning and medicine, between staying cool and staying fed. The cabin had gone completely silent except for the distant hum of the aircraft's engines. Passengers who had boarded thinking about their own business concerns now found themselves confronted with a 12-year-old who was tackling problems they had never considered, using skills they couldn't comprehend, driven by compassion they rarely encountered in their professional lives. Blackstone stood frozen in the aisle, his expensive suit and platinum status suddenly feeling like costumes in a play where he had forgotten his lines. The boy he had dismissed as an inconvenience was revealing himself to be exactly the kind of innovative entrepreneur that Blackstone's own investment firm claimed to seek out and support. The irony was as bitter as it was undeniable. As Flight 847 finally began its taxi toward the runway, the confrontation that had started over a seat assignment had transformed into something much more profound. A reckoning with assumptions, a challenge to prejudices, and a glimpse into a future where success might be measured not by age or appearance, but by the courage to solve problems that others had deemed impossible. As the plane lifted off from Atlanta, climbing through layers of morning clouds toward cruising altitude, the atmosphere in first class had shifted from confrontational to contemplative. Blackstone remained standing in the aisle, his boarding pass forgotten in his hand as he processed the implications of what he had just witnessed. The boy he had tried to displace wasn't just a passenger. He was a force of nature wrapped in a 12-year-old's body. "Mr. Blackstone," Sandra said quietly, finally remembering her professional duties. "I really do need you to take your assigned seat so we can complete our safety procedures." But before Blackstone could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Actually, I think there might be a solution that works for everyone." The speaker was Dr. Margaret Sterling, a woman in her early 60s who had been observing the entire exchange from seat 1A with the keen attention of someone accustomed to reading people and situations with surgical precision. Dr. Sterling rose gracefully from her seat, her silver hair catching the cabin light as she moved with the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding respect in rooms full of powerful men. As the founder and CEO of Sterling Dynamics, the very company Darius was scheduled to meet with the following day, she possessed a perspective on this situation that no one else in the cabin could have anticipated. "Dr. Sterling," Darius said, recognition dawning in his voice as he looked up from his tablet. "I didn't realize you were on this flight. I make it a point to travel commercially when possible," she replied with a warm smile that transformed her austere features. "It keeps me connected to the real world in ways that private jets never could. And I must say, young man, your presentation just now was far more compelling than most of the pitches I hear in my boardroom." Blackstone's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this new information. The woman he had barely noticed boarding the plane was not only a fellow passenger but the CEO of one of the most influential clean energy companies in the country. More importantly, she was the person Darius was traveling to meet, the decision-maker who could make or break the young entrepreneur's dreams. "I believe," Dr. Sterling continued, addressing Blackstone directly, "that you work for Meridian Capital, don't you? I recognize you from the Energy Investment Conference in Houston last month." Blackstone nodded stiffly, his earlier bluster evaporating as he realized the precarious position he had placed himself in. Meridian Capital had been courting Sterling Dynamics for months, hoping to secure a partnership that would give them access to the rapidly growing clean energy market. His behavior toward one of Dr. Sterling's potential partners could have serious professional consequences. "In that case," Dr. Sterling said with the diplomatic skill that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the industry, "perhaps you'd be interested in joining our conversation." Mr. Washington's work represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that the energy sector desperately needs. The invitation was graciously offered but carried an undertone that made it clear this was not really a request. Blackstone found himself nodding agreement before he had fully processed what he was agreeing to. Sandra, recognizing that the situation had evolved beyond her ability to manage, quietly retreated to allow the passengers to sort out their own seating arrangements. "I think," Dr. Sterling continued, "that Mr. Washington should remain in his rightfully purchased seat, and perhaps Mr. Blackstone could join us in the empty seat beside me. That would give us all the space we need for what promises to be a fascinating discussion." As they rearranged themselves, Darius couldn't help but marvel at how quickly the dynamics had shifted. 20 minutes earlier, he had been fighting for his right to occupy his own seat. Now he found himself in an impromptu business meeting with two of the most influential people in the clean energy sector, 30,000 feet above the ground. "Tell me about your expansion plans," Dr. Sterling said once they were settled. Her attention focused entirely on Darius with the intensity that had made her legendary in business circles. "Your current model works beautifully for individual communities, but scaling to serve millions of families presents significant challenges." Darius's eyes lit up as he launched into the detailed explanation he had been preparing for months. "The key is creating regional hubs that can provide technical support and community outreach in multiple languages and cultural contexts. We've identified 12 metropolitan areas where pilot programs could serve as proof of concept for nationwide expansion." He pulled up a comprehensive business plan that revealed months of meticulous research and planning. Market analysis, demographic studies, partnership agreements with local organizations, financial projections that accounted for everything from seasonal energy usage patterns to the economic impact of climate change on vulnerable communities. Blackstone found himself drawn into the presentation despite his earlier skepticism. The boy's grasp of complex market dynamics was sophisticated beyond his years, but more impressive was his understanding of the human elements that traditional energy companies often overlooked. Darius had identified barriers to adoption that billion-dollar corporations had missed, solutions that addressed not just technical challenges but social and cultural ones as well. "The most innovative aspect," Darius explained, his passion evident in every gesture, "is the Community Ambassador Program. Instead of hiring outside sales representatives, we train local residents to become advocates for the technology. They understand their neighbors' concerns, speak their languages, and have the trust that comes from shared experience." Dr. Sterling leaned forward, her business instincts fully engaged. "That's brilliant. It addresses the adoption curve problem that has plagued clean energy initiatives for decades. But how do you maintain quality control and consistency across such a distributed network?" The question revealed the depth of her expertise, and Darius's response demonstrated that he had anticipated this challenge. "We've developed a comprehensive training platform that combines online modules with hands-on workshops. Each ambassador completes a certification program that covers not just the technical aspects of solar installation, but also financial literacy, customer service, and community organizing." As the conversation continued, Blackstone found his perspective shifting in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. The boy he had dismissed as an inconvenience was revealing himself to be exactly the kind of visionary entrepreneur that Blackstone's own firm claimed to seek out and support. More troubling was the growing realization that his initial reaction had been driven not by legitimate business concerns, but by prejudices he had never been forced to confront. "The financial projections are particularly impressive," Dr. Sterling noted, scrolling through the detailed spreadsheets on Darius's tablet. "You're projecting profitability within 18 months while maintaining affordability for low-income families. How do you reconcile those seemingly contradictory goals?" "Volume and efficiency," Darius replied without hesitation. "Traditional energy companies have high overhead costs because they're trying to serve everyone with the same model. We focus specifically on underserved markets, which allows us to streamline our operations and pass the savings on to customers. Plus, our community-based approach reduces marketing and customer acquisition costs significantly." The business model was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. By focusing on markets that larger companies had ignored, Darius had identified an opportunity to create sustainable profits while serving communities that desperately needed affordable energy solutions. "There's something else," Darius added, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Every family that switches to our platform becomes a case study for their neighbors. When Mrs. Rodriguez sees her electricity bill drop by 50%, she tells her sister, her coworkers, her friends at church. Word-of-mouth marketing in tight-knit communities is more powerful than any advertising campaign." Dr. Sterling nodded approvingly, recognizing the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that underpinned Darius's approach. "You've identified something that most energy companies miss entirely, that trust is the most valuable currency in underserved communities, and it can't be bought with traditional marketing." As the plane reached cruising altitude and the conversation continued, Blackstone struggled with a growing sense of cognitive dissonance. Everything he thought he knew about business, about success, about who deserved respect and recognition, was being challenged by a 12-year-old who had accomplished more in 3 years than most entrepreneurs achieved in decades. The most unsettling realization was that his attempt to claim Darius's seat hadn't been about airline policies or seating preferences. It had been about maintaining a world order where success looked like him, middle-aged, white, male, and credentialed by traditional institutions. Darius represented something that threatened that order, proof that innovation and impact could come from anywhere, from anyone regardless of age or background. As the flight continued toward New York, carrying them all toward a meeting that would determine the future of clean energy access for millions of families, Blackstone found himself facing a choice that would define not just his professional future, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to recognize and support true leadership when it appeared in unexpected forms. The conversation that unfolded over the next hour transformed the first-class cabin into an impromptu boardroom where traditional hierarchies dissolved in the face of genuine innovation. Dr. Sterling's questions grew increasingly sophisticated as she probed the technical and financial foundations of Darius's platform, while Blackstone found himself reluctantly drawn into discussions that challenged every assumption he had made about the young entrepreneur. "The regulatory landscape is particularly complex," Dr. Sterling observed, pulling up utility commission documents on her own tablet. "How do you navigate the political resistance from established energy companies who see community-based solar as a threat to their monopolies?" Darius's response revealed a strategic mind that had anticipated this challenge with remarkable sophistication. "We work within existing frameworks rather than trying to disrupt them directly. Our platform helps families access programs that utility companies are already required to offer by law, but that they don't actively promote because it reduces their profits." He pulled up a case study from Birmingham, where Ecotech Solutions had helped a low-income neighborhood access a state-mandated solar rebate program that had been buried in bureaucratic paperwork for 3 years. "The utility company couldn't object because we were simply helping their customers use benefits they were legally entitled to. But the community saved over $200,000 in the first year alone." Blackstone shifted uncomfortably as he recognized the brilliance of this approach. Instead of fighting the system head-on, Darius had found ways to make it work for people who had been systematically excluded. It was the kind of strategic thinking that Blackstone's own firm paid consultants millions of dollars to develop. "The political implications are fascinating," Dr. Sterling continued, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had spent decades searching for solutions to intractable problems. "You're creating economic empowerment in communities that have been written off by traditional energy companies, which builds political support for clean energy initiatives from the ground up." "Exactly," Darius said, his eyes lighting up with the passion that had driven him through 3 years of skepticism and rejection. "When families see their electricity bills drop by half, when small businesses can afford to stay open later because of lower energy costs, when community centers can run air conditioning during heat waves, that creates constituencies for clean energy that didn't exist before." The conversation was interrupted by a flight attendant offering refreshments, and Blackstone found himself studying Darius with new eyes as the boy politely declined alcohol and asked for orange juice instead. The reminder of his age was jarring. This sophisticated business strategist was still young enough to need a booster seat in most restaurants. "Mr. Blackstone," Dr. Sterling said, turning her attention to him with the directness that had made her legendary in business negotiations. "Your firm specializes in energy sector investments, doesn't it? What's your assessment of Mr. Washington's model?" The question put Blackstone in an impossible position. His professional expertise told him that Darius had identified a genuine market opportunity with enormous potential for both profit and social impact. But acknowledging this would require admitting that his initial dismissal of the boy had been based on prejudice rather than business judgment. "It's innovative," he said carefully, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "The focus on underserved markets is smart, and the community-based approach addresses real barriers to adoption that larger companies have struggled with." Dr. Sterling's eyebrows rose slightly at the grudging nature of his praise. "That's quite an understatement. What Mr. Washington has accomplished represents a fundamental reimagining of how energy companies can serve low-income communities while maintaining profitability. It's exactly the kind of breakthrough that the industry has been searching for." Blackstone felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized how his lukewarm assessment sounded in comparison to Dr. Sterling's enthusiastic endorsement. "You're right, of course. I may have been too conservative in my initial evaluation." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Darius looked at him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor accusatory, but simply curious. "What made you change your mind?" the boy asked, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than challenge. The question forced Blackstone to confront the uncomfortable truth about his own biases. "Honestly, when I first saw you in that seat, I made assumptions based on your age and other factors. I didn't think someone your age could possibly have legitimate business reasons for flying first class." "Other factors," Darius repeated quietly, and Blackstone realized that the boy understood exactly what he meant without forcing him to say it explicitly. "Yes," Blackstone said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ashamed to admit that your race influenced my assumptions about whether you belonged in first class. It was wrong, and I apologize." The apology was more honest than anything Blackstone had said in years, stripped of the corporate doublespeak that usually characterized his professional interactions. Dr. Sterling watched the exchange with the keen attention of someone who had spent decades navigating similar prejudices in her own career. "Apology accepted," Darius said simply, then added with wisdom beyond his years. "But the real question is what you do with that recognition going forward." Before Blackstone could respond, Dr. Sterling's phone chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it, then looked up with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Gentlemen, I've just received some interesting news. The Department of Energy has announced a new initiative to fund clean energy projects in underserved communities. The application deadline is next month, and the total funding available is $500 million. Darius's eyes widened as he processed the implications. "That could fund expansion to every major metropolitan area in the country," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We could reach millions of families." "Indeed," Dr. Sterling agreed. "But the application process will be highly competitive, and preference will be given to partnerships between established companies and innovative startups. The kind of partnership that brings together experience and fresh thinking." She looked meaningfully between Darius and Blackstone, the implication clear. "Mr. Blackstone, your firm has the regulatory expertise and political connections that could be invaluable in navigating the federal application process. And Mr. Washington has exactly the kind of innovative approach that the Department of Energy is looking for." Blackstone felt the weight of opportunity and redemption settling on his shoulders. Here was a chance not just to correct his earlier mistake, but to be part of something genuinely transformative. "You're suggesting a partnership between Meridian Capital and Ecotech Solutions?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Sterling said with a smile, "that sometimes the most powerful partnerships are born from the most unexpected encounters. Mr. Washington needs the kind of institutional support that your firm can provide, and your firm needs the innovation and community connections that his platform represents." Darius looked between the two adults, his young mind racing through the possibilities and potential pitfalls of such an arrangement. "What would that partnership look like in practice?" he asked, his voice carrying the caution of someone who had learned to be wary of adults bearing gifts. "Equal partnership," Blackstone said, surprising himself with the immediacy of his response. "Your technology, your community relationships, your vision. Our capital, our regulatory expertise, our political connections. Shared decision-making, shared profits, shared commitment to the mission. The offer was more generous than anything Darius had dared to hope for when he boarded the plane that morning. But more than the financial implications, it represented something he had been searching for throughout his young career: recognition from the traditional business establishment that his work had value beyond its novelty. "There's one condition," Darius said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "The Community Ambassador Program remains central to everything we do. We don't sacrifice the human element for the sake of efficiency or profit margins." "Agreed," Blackstone said without hesitation. "In fact, I think that's exactly what will make this partnership successful. You've identified something that traditional energy companies have missed: that sustainable business models have to be built on sustainable relationships with the communities they serve." As the plane began its descent toward New York, the three unlikely partners found themselves sketching out the framework for a collaboration that could reshape how America approached clean energy access. What had started as a confrontation over airline seating had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated: a meeting of minds that transcended age, race, and traditional business hierarchies. Dr. Sterling watched the exchange with satisfaction, recognizing that she was witnessing the birth of exactly the kind of innovative partnership that the clean energy sector desperately needed. "Gentlemen," she said as the captain announced their final approach, "I believe we're about to make history." 6 months later, the gleaming conference room on the 42nd floor of Sterling Dynamics headquarters buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the Manhattan skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Representatives from the Department of Energy sat alongside community leaders from 12 cities, venture capitalists mixed with solar installation technicians, and at the center of it all, Darius Washington stood before a room of 200 people, no longer fighting for recognition but commanding it with the quiet authority that had become his trademark. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The federal grant application that had seemed like an impossible dream during that turbulent flight had not only been approved, but had become the largest clean energy community development award in Department of Energy history. $500 million would flow through the partnership between Ecotech Solutions and Meridian Capital over the next 5 years, bringing sustainable power to over 2 million families across the United States. "When I started this company 3 years ago," Darius began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, "I thought the biggest challenge would be the technology. I thought if I could just build a better app, create more efficient algorithms, design smarter systems, that would be enough to solve the problem." He paused, his gaze finding familiar faces in the crowd. Dr. Sterling sat in the front row, her expression radiating the pride of a mentor watching her protege succeed. Blackstone occupied a seat nearby, his transformation from skeptic to advocate having become one of the most talked-about partnerships in the clean energy sector. Sandra Mills, the flight attendant who had witnessed their first encounter, had accepted Darius's invitation to attend, her presence a reminder of how far they had all traveled from that moment of confrontation. "But I learned something important on a flight from Atlanta to New York," Darius continued, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that had made him one of the most sought-after speakers in the industry. "The biggest barriers to innovation aren't technical, they're human. They're the assumptions we make about who deserves to be heard, who belongs in positions of leadership, who has the right to dream big and demand that those dreams be taken seriously." The audience listened with rapt attention, many of them familiar with the story of how a seating dispute had led to one of the most successful public-private partnerships in recent memory. But Darius's telling focused not on the conflict itself, but on the transformation that had followed. "Mr. Blackstone," Darius said, gesturing toward his business partner, "taught me that people can change when they're willing to confront their own biases honestly. Our partnership works not because we ignore the prejudices that initially divided us, but because we've learned to use that awareness to build something stronger." Blackstone shifted slightly in his seat, still uncomfortable with public attention but no longer ashamed of the journey that had brought him to this moment. The past 6 months had been the most professionally fulfilling of his career, as he discovered that supporting genuine innovation was far more satisfying than simply managing other people's money. "The numbers tell part of our story," Darius continued, clicking to a slide that showed the impact of their expanded program. "Average energy cost reductions of 58%. Over 15,000 jobs created in installation, maintenance, and community outreach. Carbon emissions reduced by the equivalent of taking 300,000 cars off the road. The statistics were impressive, but Darius knew that data alone couldn't capture the human impact of their work. But the real measure of our success isn't in spreadsheets or government reports. It's in stories like Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who started college this fall because her family could finally afford tuition thanks to the money they saved on electricity. It's in the community center in Birmingham that can now stay open during heat waves, providing refuge for elderly residents who might otherwise suffer from heat-related illness. He clicked to another slide showing a photograph that had become iconic in clean energy circles. A group of children playing in a playground powered entirely by solar panels optimized through Ecotech's algorithms. The image captured everything the partnership represented. Innovation serving humanity, technology bridging divides, hope made manifest in concrete improvements to daily life. Today, we're announcing the next phase of our expansion, Darius said, his voice rising with excitement. Thanks to additional funding from Sterling Dynamics and a consortium of impact investors, we're launching Ecotech International, bringing our community-based approach to underserved populations in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The announcement sent a ripple of excitement through the audience. Dr. Sterling had been working behind the scenes for months to secure the international funding, recognizing that Darius's model had applications far beyond American communities. The global expansion would eventually serve over 10 million families, making it one of the largest clean energy initiatives in history. But perhaps most importantly, Darius continued, we're launching the Young Innovators Fellowship, a program that will provide funding, mentorship, and platform access to entrepreneurs under 18 who are working on solutions to climate change and energy poverty. This announcement was personal for Darius, reflecting his understanding of how many young people faced the same dismissive attitudes that had nearly derailed his own journey. The fellowship would ensure that age would never again be a barrier to bringing transformative ideas to market. As the presentation concluded and the audience erupted in sustained applause, Darius felt a moment of profound gratitude for the chain of events that had brought him to this point. The confrontation on Flight 847 had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been necessary. A catalyst that forced uncomfortable truths into the open and created space for genuine transformation. During the reception that followed, Blackstone approached Darius with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about that day on the plane. If I hadn't been such an ass about the seating, we might never have had that conversation with Dr. Sterling." Darius smiled, recognizing the irony that had become a running joke between them. "Sometimes the worst moments create the best opportunities," he replied, "but only if we're willing to learn from them instead of just moving on." "Speaking of learning," Blackstone said, pulling out his phone to show Darius a news article, "there's something you should see. The airline industry is implementing new training programs on unconscious bias, partly in response to our story going public. Sandra Mills is actually leading the initiative for her airline." The news filled Darius with a satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. Real change was happening, systems were being examined and reformed, and future young travelers might never face the kind of discrimination he had experienced. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Dr. Sterling approached Darius with a small wrapped package. "A little something to commemorate today," she said with a warm smile. Inside was a first-class boarding pass from Flight 847, laminated and mounted in an elegant frame. Below it was an engraved plaque that read, "Sometimes the journey matters more than the destination. Sometimes the obstacles become the path." "I thought you might want to remember where this all started," Dr. Sterling said. "Not the conflict, but the moment when you chose to stand up for yourself and your dreams, even when it would have been easier to just move to economy." Darius studied the boarding pass, remembering the 12-year-old boy who had clutched it so tightly while fighting for his right to occupy the seat he had earned. That boy had been brilliant and determined, but he had also been alone, carrying the weight of his dreams without institutional support or adult allies who truly understood his vision. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for seeing past my age, for believing in the work, for helping me understand that real partnerships are built on mutual respect rather than charity." "Thank you," Dr. Sterling replied, for reminding me that innovation doesn't follow a schedule or respect traditional hierarchies. The clean energy sector is better because you refuse to wait your turn or accept other people's limitations. As Darius made his way home that evening, the framed boarding pass tucked carefully under his arm, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from a confrontation over airline seating to a partnership that would impact millions of lives. The path had been neither straight nor easy, marked by moments of doubt, instances of prejudice, and the constant challenge of proving himself in rooms full of adults who saw his age before his achievements. But it had also been marked by unexpected allies, transformative partnerships, and the gradual recognition that his youth was not a limitation to overcome but a strength to leverage. At 15 now, Darius had learned that the most powerful changes often began with the simplest acts of courage, refusing to accept that someone else's assumptions should define your possibilities, standing firm in your convictions even when the whole world seems to be watching, and maintaining faith that the right people will eventually recognize and support genuine innovation. The boarding pass would hang in his office as a reminder that every seat at every table had to be earned, but that once earned, it belonged to whoever had the vision and determination to occupy it with purpose. And in a world still learning to recognize leadership in unexpected forms, that reminder would continue to matter for years to come. If this story has reminded you that age, background, and appearance don't determine someone's capacity for innovation and leadership, share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of standing up for their dreams. Subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that celebrate the courage it takes to challenge assumptions and create change, because the future belongs to those brave enough to claim their rightful place at the table, regardless of who thinks they don't belong there.